This is the Comics Alternative Euro Comics, reviews of Soft City and the World of Edena. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Euro Comics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Edward. And we're almost two guys with full PhDs who love talking about comics.
That's right. And on the November Euro Comics episode, Edward and I are going to talk about two recent publications. First, we're going to begin with Pushwagner's Soft City. And then after that, we're going to look at the first volume in Dark Horse's new Moebius Library, The World of Edena. But before we get into those discussions, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Euro Comics is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes as much as 50% off. But many times you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
Right. For instance, right now, the first volume of Moebius, Dark Horse's new Moebius Library, The World of Edena, which we'll be discussing today, is 40% off. That's 300 plus pages of Moebius awesomeness for only $29.99.
Wow.
And it's also a great time to catch up on NBM's Miss Don't Touch Me series, a story of a woman's revenge for her sister's murder as she infiltrates a high-class call girl bordello. So and that's if you missed out on the series when they came out volume by volume, NBM's now doing a collected edition at 30% off. It's only $20.99.
And that's great. I really love that series, and it's nice to see that they're coming out with that in a one-volume release. So that's just a couple of examples of the many discounts you will find at Discount Comic Book Service. Check out their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Edward and Derek sent you. Well, Edward, before we jump into this month's discussion, let's share with our listeners a couple of email messages that we've received from listeners.
Oh, goody, mailbag.
Mail time. Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
Keep them coming, please. We love them.
Yeah, we do. And now this first email is from a longtime listener of the show. He's also a Patreon supporter, Christopher Baird. Now, he wrote us about the comics alternative as a whole, like the weekly review show specifically, but in this email he mentioned something about what you and I do on the Eurocomic series. He says, I'm really enjoying the Eurocomic show. Coincidentally, I have been back ordering the Incal series from Humanoids through DCB Service this past year, so it's great to have other suggestions. So thank you, Christopher. It's great to hear that Edward and I can help provide you with more reading ideas in the Eurocomics category.
Absolutely. And, the Incal's a classic. I hope Dark Horse keeps the Moebius coming. There's a lot of other great science fiction from other heavy metal stalwarts coming out from Titan. It's a good time to rediscover the world of the hallucinatory world of 70s French sci-fi.
That's right. And we got another email over the past couple of weeks from another individual who's been listening to us for some time, and that is Paul Spence. And he writes, I really enjoy the manga and Eurocomic shows. I want to thank you for discussing Tyler Cross Blackrock. On the basis of that discussion, I picked it up in a recent Comixology sale, and I really enjoyed the story and the cartoony art style. I quickly turned around and bought Tyler Cross' Angola, which I am currently reading. It's every bit as good as the first installment was. This is something of a golden age for crime noir comics with quality material coming from creators on both sides of the Atlantic. And here he's referring to a recent 2-episode crime comic series that Andy Kunke and I did. He says, I wonder if you will take a look on the Eurocomic Show at Jacques Tardy's West Coast Blues. It would fit right in with the current discussions of the podcast of crime comics. I want to thank the Comics Alternative podcasters for generating great ideas for new comics to read that fall outside the capes and tights crowd. Yours truly, Paul Spence. So thank you, Paul. That's a great message.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and we definitely want to do a Tardy episode. I mean, there's a major figure that we'd love to cover. Maybe we can pair one of his crime comics with one of his World War I comics, for example, or something like that. I know he's done quite a lot of noir, and I think the writer for West Coast, Manchette. Here's an interesting tidbit. I mean, he's a major French crime writer whose novels have been translated into English through New York Review Books, of which published Pushwagner that we'll be discussing this week. But Manchette, I think, was the French translator for Watchmen, among other things. So there's definitely this sort of transatlantic commerce in translation, in comics translation, that it's a little circle. Yeah, I think
what you're saying though. What you're saying, though, reminds me, and what our listeners are recommending to us is, when it comes to the Eurocomic series, there's just so much for you and I to discuss on the show. And in fact, right before we started recording today, you and I were talking off mic about possibilities for future episodes. I mean, it's entirely conceivable that we could do an entire show on Tardy, and not just 2 books. We could look at several of his works. And, the possibilities are endless here. I mean, you and I, we could easily take this into something more than just a monthly show. It's just that we don't have time for anything more than a monthly show.
Sure. Unless we go Patreon. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, Edward, let's go ahead and jump into this month's books, and we're going to start with Soft City, and this came out a little while back from New York Review Comics, and the artist is Hariton Pushwagner, whose real name is, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Terje Brofos.
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine there.
Yeah. Now, he's Norwegian, and in fact, he was born in Oslo in 1940. And a little background on Soft City. This is a project that he began back in 1969, and it does have that, let's say, late 60s, early 70s feel to it, both visually and also in terms of its tone. It was completed in 1975, and so it was published, but then it went out of print, but then it was, according to the introductory material, rediscovered in Oslo in 2002. And so now what we...
circumstances. Right?
Yeah. And so what we have now is, in an English translation, a brand new large format edition from New York Review Comics. And let's talk a little bit about the format, because you and I have talked a little bit about New York Review Comics in the past. They're relatively new to the game, so to speak, and they published their first book this year, which is something that you know a little bit about, right?
Right. Well, I think because I was part of their, I translated the only French graphic novel in their opening season. I think they're doing about 6 books a year to start with, and it was Blutch's Peplum, which I know you guys have discussed on the regular show.
No, we discussed with you. Remember,
yeah,
we interviewed you and Jamie.
Yeah. Peplum. Well, yeah. So then I've had the pleasure of working with them. They're really great. Gabe and Lucas are really terrific guys who really know their stuff. Lucas himself is an artist, and Gabe writes a lot on comics for the New York Review of Books. And Yeah, they're really looking for what no one else will touch, what they can rescue, that will be singular and they're trying to also balance their list of translated works with also rescuing out of print items. I think I think they started with Agony, right? Was their first one, and then came Peplum, and then
that's right. Yeah, Agony was before Peplum. Yeah, I thought Peplum was first.
No, it's as Agony, Peplum, and then a collection of Glenn Baxter's cartoons. Right.
Yeah, so really good things coming from New York Review Comics, and I mentioned the large format. I mean, this is a large album format, and in fact, I'm holding the copy as I'm talking into the microphone. I don't know how long I'll be able to do this because my arms will tire. I mean, it's a beautiful volume, and the kind of art that we see here really wouldn't work nearly as well in a much smaller edition. So this larger album format is definitely appropriate, but as with many larger format books, find a comfortable place to read it.
Would you say it's about 16 by 12? Would you say that's about right?
I would guess so, and I guess we could have looked this up before we started to record.
No,
but I mean, the dimensions we could easily find on Amazon.
The reason I asked that is because, that's, I believe, the actual size of the originals. And the New York Review comics, they're a little outside the comic scene, so I'm glad and they're also very new, so I'm glad we're able to bring them to the attention of comics readers who are looking for, stuff that's a little off the beaten path. But I believe that the reason their books are all different sizes. I mean, Agony is tiny and square, and I believe the reason they went with Peplum is about the size of the original French, and the reason they went with this is to preserve the actual size of Pushwagner's drawings, which have been displayed in galleries. But I think this is just how big they are.
Yeah. Now, I did look that up on Amazon, and it says that the book dimensions are 9.7 by 13.6, which strikes me as a little small compared to what I have in my hand right now. So you're right in that New York Review Comics puts out things that other publishers wouldn't, and we're doing a service to comicsdom by discussing these things that our listeners probably aren't familiar with. So in terms of familiarizing people with Soft City, how would you describe this?
Oh, boy. Well, it is helpful, I think, that New York Review was able to land a preface by Chris Ware and an afterword to sort of give a lot of context to this, because this is really sort of an eccentric work. It's kind of like Martin Vaughn's The Cage. It's really kind of out on the border, the edges of even faithful alt comics readers.
Right. Right. Now, Chris Ware did the intro, but Martin Herbert, who is an associate editor of Art Review, did the afterword.
Yeah, and it's a good balance because that's really where this book exists. It exists between, Pushwagner is primarily a visual artist, a gallery visual artist, a fine artist, let us say, but then he set out to make this book a comic. It was not made, even though it's been displayed in galleries, even though it was rediscovered really in 2008 at the Berlin Biennial, right? But and it was the pages were hung in a gallery there, but they were pages. They weren't meant to be. They weren't prints, that were then that's really where this book is, and it's definitely not outright SF in any way, yet it's got this sort of oppressive dystopian SF feel to it that Pushwagner really achieves through this obsessive amount of detail on a vast canvas. He's a lot of double-page, two-page spreads, but even when he doesn't, he has a lot of large panels that he really just spent extravagant amounts of time on repetitively detailing things. Tons of people, tons of cars, seas of almost but never quite identically faced humans all doing the same thing, more in the same motion, opening doors in unison, sitting down in unison, carrying briefcases in unison, saying goodbye to their husbands in unison. But maybe we should back up and I should back up and try to like give a sketch of the shape of the book. It's a one day in the life of, right?
Right. Now, we just real quick, you mentioned something about the dystopian nature of Soft City, and one of the things that Chris Ware points out in his introduction is that he likens this to works such as Fritz Lang's Metropolis, Orwell's 1984, Huxley's Brave New World, and also Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Although one of the things that strikes me as different between Soft City and, let's say, especially 1984 in Brave New World is that the tone is not as nefarious and as dark.
Sure. No,
or at least overtly so in Soft City as it is in 1984 in Brave New World.
Sure, and I think he drops another name too. Then I think this is very, very accurate. Is Jacques Tati's Playtime. Mm-hmm. I think you can see that all over this. I mean, especially in the car scenes and the office scenes. I mean, and also the scenes of people watching TV in their homes, but seen from a distance through framed-in apartment windows. I mean, those are all major set pieces in Tati's Playtime. And you know, Tati's Playtime is a fairly, even though it's an indictment of a modern world that he saw coming into being and that he feared was faceless and personalityless. It's also a playful. Like everything else of Tati's, it's a playful satire that has, you know, it cherishes the human ability to create disorder and chaos at the heart of whatever is placed on them. I don't think that quite breaks out in Pushwagner. There's not. I don't think that there's tiny moments of nonconformity, but they're little eccentricities. There's not like a big scene of a bacchanalian release the way there is at the end of Playtime.
Right. And those moments of quote-unquote rebellion are usually thoughts, right? Particular ideas or dreams that certain characters that we see occasionally may have. But those are fleeting and in passing. And I'm glad that you pointed out the Tati for a couple of reasons. One, I have not seen a Jacques Tati film in years. Boy, it's been a long time. So, I mean, those are good memories to recall. But also, there is something, I don't know if comedic is the right word, but a little on the lighter side of Soft City. In other words, this is not an outright indictment of something that could be in terms of a faceless, almost soulless society. But it's just there, right? So if I had to define the tone, Pushwagner's tone in Soft City, I probably do it describe it as a more neutral one. Yeah, and one of the first things that stuck out to me, like one of the first moments that I really sort of caught on as a reader, snagged on as a reader, and it's really before the major set pieces of conformity begin. It's before there's like it's one day in the life of, there's a little nuclear family lives in an apartment building, and there's mother, father, child. The child is the first to wake up, sees the other apartments through the window, and then the parents wake up, they go through their morning routine, and the father's leaving for work, and as he's at the door, he kisses his wife, and his wife is counting. And it was like, so is she, does she not, is the kiss just kind of so routine for her that she's ticking off the seconds? Is she, it's just a funny moment, or it's like she's doing what needs to be done. It's like, okay, a kiss for 10 seconds, and she's counting down to make sure she satisfies the requirements.
Right. So, and that was, and then right after that, you get one of the first major, set pieces of massive numbers of people doing the same thing. But it's a funny moment, and as you say, throughout the book, there people have these thoughts. Little private thoughts. Although he'll have like a massive crowd scene, and then there'll be one person thinking of being James Bond or
being on a beach.
Yeah, being on a beach. Granted, these are also very cliched thoughts. They're the kind of thoughts that you would see on posters in the subway in a large metropolis. They're every bit as mass made as everything else that's going on. but they do have this sort of weird gesture toward Walter Mitty-esque desperation to them, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny, as we're discussing this, a song popped into my head, and it's the Kinks' "Well-Respected Man," which seemed to be a perfect musical backdrop for this. Now, you've mentioned something that struck your attention toward the beginning. The wife counting down. One of my big takeaways here is just the book's symmetry, and it's kind of a simple symmetry, so there's nothing too subtle or even really unique about it, but it's interesting nonetheless. And so you can look at this book, and it ends as it begins in kind of a mirrored fashion, right? So you can take the book and open it about halfway, and you have the second half that reflects back in inverse sequential order of what we saw in the first half. I mean, not completely, but enough to where you do see some kind of pattern. And where it begins, it actually is with these words, on a completely black page. "Good morning, everybody. Look." And then we see the top of, we don't know what it is at first, but it turns out to be an apartment building with all these different apartments and antennas on top. And then you turn the page, "Here comes," and we get a little closer up to the apartment building so we can start to see what it is. And then you turn the page, "The sun." So, here comes the sun. And as the sun is rising over top of the apartment building, we see it has an eye. And then turning the page again, we see a baby. And one of the things that's most prominent about the baby is its eyes.
Yeah.
And it says the baby is awake. So here we're linking both the eyes of the baby with the eye that's embedded in the sun. And so then we get to that part that you had mentioned, right? The baby waking up and then starting to experience the morning, right, where he sees the sun coming up, he sees out the window of the other apartments, he goes into his parents' room and sees them asleep, and then it just goes from there. And then when the father leaves, the mother says, "Daddy's leaving," and he, wave goodbye to Daddy. And then we have, toward the end of the book, kind of the inverse of that, right? The father, along with all the other fathers and some mothers, come back from work, come into the apartment, the baby welcomes the father back, and, people get ready to go. They have dinner, get ready to go to bed, and then go to sleep. And it ends with, toward the very end, the baby in the crib again. "Look," and as I'm turning the past several pages, or last several pages, these are the words. "Look, here comes the moon. Goodbye." That's it. And it ends on that black page background, just as it began. So symmetrically or structure-wise, I think this is a fascinating work. Again, nothing overly sophisticated, but that's okay. But it's this middle part that seems, and I wanted to ask you about this, when the fathers and a few mothers are at work, I got the sense that the routine of being at work, of people monitoring the things that they're monitoring, the big boss sitting up top kind of dictating what everyone's to do, this seemed to be where the narrative, as it is, slowed down a bit. But then again, I don't think that narrative action is this book's strong suit. It's not, its main goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, what I got more out of it was sort of textures. I think Ware talks about it as a poem, and like I mean, in terms of textures, I find his people very uncanny because often only the faces are filled in, but the eyes have this like glassy doll eye kind of look. They're huge and detailed and not was kind of devoid of expression, especially on the baby's face, and like there's even though I mean there's some characterization for the boss man, but everyone else, does that. Like, he, even when he's looking at the people, he's like, they're asleep. There's definitely a slowdown when it gets to the middle. But I think the action shifts to the boss man and his sort of survey of all the industries that he's involved in. And the sort of unanswered question of the middle, right, of the book is who controls the controller, right?
And those are the words, in the middle of the book. Who controls the controller? Yeah,
but like I do think there's several traditions here that I feel like, there are definitely things about this book that seem to date it from the time of its making. But at the same time, like, we can see works both before and after that this book that are part of the same set of fears and part of the same set of, the recent film adaptation, Ben Wheatley's film adaptation of Ballard's High Rise, the supermarket scenes here are, there's a lot more people in the supermarket here, but like the supermarket scenes here, have that, they're linked to that. But of course, Ballard's work is more contemporaneous with Soft City. Right, but at the same, or if you want to look at it structurally, you get this one day in the life of, I think Ware mentions Solzhenitsyn as something that Pushwagner actually cited as an influence one day. But then, there's these one day in the life of as a structure, is also a fairly common narrative gambit, especially if you're looking at a critique kind of thing. Like, I think. Not just Huxley's Brave New World, but Huxley's Island is a one day in the life of expositional kind of take on a quasi utopia, or you could even say Groundhog Day is a one day in the life of kind of story.
Right. Now you mentioned the supermarket. We should fill in a little background that as the fathers are at the office doing what they do in a very routine manner, right? The mothers do something similar when they go out shopping. So they take their babies, they go to the supermarket all together en masse, just as the men go to work en masse. And then you have a similar scene at the supermarket with the mothers that visually and also subject-wise is basically the same as what the men do in the office.
Yeah, and you get the sort of boss man looking at them all on little TV screens, right? There's a double page spread where where the thousands upon thousands of the sort of almost Busby Berkeley lines of mothers are all reaching for cans at the same moment, and the scenes of the supermarket are fractured across a bank of monitors, and then
that's right.
And then at the bottom you get all this the mothers lining up with their baskets at endlessly for the checkouts, and I guess they're all whistling or humming the same tune, which like hovers over them in an unbroken string of notes, like that. Like it's like they're all contributing to this one hum. I
hum like a hive, like the buzz of a beehive.
Yeah, I think another much later work, like Playtime would have been around already when this was made, but a much later work, a more recent Scandinavian work, I think he's Swedish, Roy Andersson, a director that this reminds me of, because he's known for staging these he's got these relatively normal length films, but that are filled with extremely long takes, like 8 to 12 minute takes, where he just plants the camera down, really deep focus, and he has a really, really elaborately timed and staged, often farcical or deadpan humor in a very futile, despairing way, of like some kind of scene of how despairing it is to be alive today. Like kind of like a really slow, like a guy who moves a chair to the center of the room so he can get up on it and whack at his apartment ceiling with a broom because his neighbor is making too much noise, or like really slow, long jokes, but they're really meticulously choreographed and sometimes involve large numbers of people as well. And so I think that and the Scandinavian aspect maybe sort of made me associate those two as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now you mentioned that scene toward the little after the middle of the book where the women are in the grocery store, and the controller, we assume, we don't know for a fact, but it seems like the controller is watching from multiple monitors them doing their shopping. And he says something into a microphone as he's watching all of these screens, soft consume. And that's another thing that's notable about this book is the use of the word soft, because everything in this world, the world of Soft City, is soft one thing or soft another. So, for instance, the women in this grocery store, the mothers are buying a canned product called soft meat.
Which they have later at home, right? I think they...
Right, yeah. Yes, exactly. And then another point, an earlier point, the controller is in his office, and he is, again, punching up buttons to bring up certain images, I think one of his own family, his own baby, and as he's pressing a button, he says, soft modern touch. And a little later, he is thinking to himself, soft bartender cream feeling. So, sometimes these things may not make much sense, but we have, the soft city, the soft parking, the soft radio. So everything is soft.
And the more ominous ones where, he's looking at his weapons factories and his, I think a slew of fighter planes, and he says soft atom roll dollars. There's a soft Megaton 4T rocket on a poster in his. I do think that's one of the that's when they talk in the preface about Pushwagner saying he was on he was taking serious LSD, dropping serious acid when he was the dialogue, the stream. They call it stream of consciousness, but it's not really stream. Whose consciousness would that be a stream of, other than this ambient advertising radio noise? I feel like the only two kinds of dialogue in this book are, and very much so on purpose, are sort of banalities and niceties, like how do you do, or they're this sort of gibberish that often contains a gibberish of buzzwords and ad slogans and the word soft. And it's the funny thing is, I'm mentioning to you before, Derek, how I felt like this week we were looking at two books that are both new releases right now, but are also both reprints of a much of older work from the 70s, so roughly older and roughly well, actually not quite contemporaneous. One is from the late 80s and one from the late 70s, but they both actually feature things in them that speak this kind of gibberish, right? I mean, in one of the Edenas, there are these these flying little faces that look like little Sputniks with faces, like hypotons or something like that. And they're talking in this truncated legal phrases from that. It seems like random phrases taken from red tape documents, So that's in it's. I mean, and there's a definite that I think both those are surrealist tactics, right? They're coming from a specific surrealist tradition, which we can link that visually here to Soft City as well, because they he actually collages newspaper into his drawings, which are otherwise very simple. Well, not simple. I wouldn't call them simple, but they're a lot of line work.
Right. Now, you were mentioning some of this gibberish. I couldn't help but just flip through, and I found the page when we first see the boss as he's entering the business, which is called Soft Ink. And he gets out of the car and walking to his office. He's thinking to himself, air conditioning, charming value for money, clean system, brain-free circus. So now, what the hell does brain-free circus mean? Or even what we see on the next page, soft love is a 100% bonne affaire. Atomize is der dick tricks. So it's not as if you have to make sense of all of this, but that's that's part of what this text is about. You mentioned that Ware mentions that this is more poetic the narrative in form, and that's right. Instead of trying to make sense of everything that's going on in this book, just take it as it comes and let it kind of seep into you. And I think it's the best way of appreciating Soft City.
Yeah, and it really does. I mean, I think dystopian, a certain kind of dystopian imagery, it is a testament to how familiar it has become and how this would have still been on its leading edge at the time. But like on the very next page, or 2 pages later from the page you just read, you get like the was it 2 pages? No, on the very next page, you get like the boss man on a large screen speaking at all the seated employees, and it actually kind of reminded me of that Apple. The Apple commercial that made Ridley Scott famous in the early 80s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which was also 1984, informed.
Exactly. So yeah, this is a definitely an interesting text, and I was not familiar with this before this new book. I had not even heard of it. Now, had you, before New York Review Comics announced that they were going to be releasing this?
No, I wasn't aware of it. No.
Well, it's definitely an interesting find.
Yeah, I do think, Paul. I was reading Paul Gravett, the British comics scholar and advocate. He had an interesting article about going to see a gallery exhibit of Pushwagners in Milton Keynes, and Milton Keynes is one of the one of the famous Ebenezer Howard's top-down planned cities in England. A garden city is what he called it, but like it was supposed to be utopian urban planning, but from this sort of imposed kind of it's something that went out of fashion, right? And so, but somehow something that very much suits a soft city. And one thing that struck me was that he talks about how as you looked at the pages displayed in glass cases, you could see that you could see the shaky ink lines, you could see whiteout, you could see things, the glue lines where things were, and he says, none of this, of course, is visible in the pristine printed graphic novel in black and white with spots of color, but this was the artwork made for reproduction, not exhibition. And again, I guess I just think that's really unique for, because there's kind of this, a little bit of a argument over, whether in order to raise, whether in order to enhance respect for comics, we should hang it up in galleries, or whether it's really just it's supposed to be a book in the hands of an object in the hands of a reader. And it's interesting again that this is not it's displayed as fine art, but it's not fine art. It's clearly meant to be a comic. It's the idea of being made for reproduction seems it's like, I think Henry Jenkins in some of his work on comics has stressed how investigated how friable it is as a medium, and how cheaply made, and then how transient, or how destroyable, decayable, I guess, and
right.
I guess he contrasts that with how certain artists like fill their panels with paraphernalia and stuff and objects, like as if they were a repository for stuff to survive in a physical form, even though it's in a very fleeting, evanescent, ephemeral medium. But yeah, I thought that was interesting. That this was made for reproduction, not exhibition.
Right. We know you mentioned Garden Cities, and I think that is a cue for us and a good segue to move on to the next title that we're discussing this month, and that is The World of Edena.
Garden Worlds.
That's right. Now, this is coming out from Dark Horse Books, and this is the first volume in their Moebius Library series. And in fact, I'm curious to see, or I will be curious to see, what other Moebius works will be coming out through this series. I emailed just the other day a publicist there at Dark Horse who actually sent the World of Edena and was asking her if she knew of any future or which future volumes are planned for this. And she didn't know off the top of her head. And so what that might suggest is that Dark Horse is still in negotiations, perhaps, with the estate of Jean Giraud
Yeah,
to
Isabelle
see
Giraud
Moebius.
I believe since their marriage, Isabelle Giraud has become her late husband's. She's not only now the primary rights holder for a lot of work and the representative of his estate, but even while he was still alive, she was his publisher and agent. And I think the last his last long series, which was sort of a memoir-ish 6-volume memoir series called Inside Moebius, was published, directly by her as opposed to with any of the established French publishers he'd worked for before. So she's long been involved in his business affairs, and I honestly don't know enough myself to say anything. So, and there's a lot of bad blood and slander flying around out there about what it is, who exactly has been holding up the rights, and I don't feel close enough to, or well informed enough to make any pronouncements there. But I know that shortly after Moebius's untimely death in 2012. Just when Humanoids was stepping up the reissues of a lot of the work that apparently they owned the rights to, but only in other languages and not yet in English, there was a lot of furor among fans, like, why isn't it being into English? Why isn't it being brought into English again? Why aren't the reissues coming out? Why isn't this work being made available? He's a treasure. It's time to introduce him to a new generation. All this kind of stuff, and I even was contacted by the head of a fan group to help him draft a letter to Isabelle Giraud. So, I've heard lots of conflicting stories, and I don't really know who to believe, but I do know that those rights are famously tangled up, and there's so that's why you see Humanoids doing certain books. But
right. Now, earlier we had one of our listeners, Christopher Baird, mentioned that he's getting the Incal series from Humanoids, and this is something that Moebius did with Alejandro Jodorowsky.
Yeah.
And so that is still in print, and you can get that through Humanoids.
Yeah, and I think that may be because Humanoids has a different deal with Jodorowsky, even, because I know they've put out a lot of his work, including Bouncer, which we hope to cover sometime.
Right, yeah, we're going to be covering that in maybe a future episode in the next couple of months on Westerns.
Yeah.
But now, I have not, I feel when it comes to Jean Giraud or Moebius, at a disadvantage, for years, obviously. I've known about him, I've read about him, but I don't feel that I've experienced much of his actual work. And this is the first complete book that Moebius has done that I have read, because the other Moebius that I've read, for instance, Blueberry Stories, have been in bits and pieces here or there, in collections or excerpts, but never an entire book until now. So I haven't even read the Incal. So this is a first for me, and I feel like such a novice coming to Moebius. What is your experience, Edward, with Moebius?
Yeah, I've mostly read some of the later Blueberries, and I've read Arzak and the Airtight Garage. So I haven't been a completist in that I have picked up an edition, read it, all in French, all in French. So then and then maybe not tracked down short stories that appeared later in different as an addendum to what I just said just now, in terms of the reprints in English, who knows? There was even stories about how Marvel still owned rights because they put out, or
some of his stuff. Yeah.
So it's tough to say, but yeah. So like I had I think he's just one of the unavoidable figures. He's one of the few French figures to achieve truly international renown. I think in the obituary that Kim Thompson wrote for him at the Comics Journal, it was him, Crumb, Charles Schultz, and Tardy. And Tardy's still someone that I think people don't know quite as well because he didn't have, at least in the States, because he didn't have that run of heavy metal to sort of and he didn't do a Silver Surfer story with Stan Lee.
Right. And some people may not know that Moebius actually has, even if they haven't read the comics, they could be familiar with Moebius's work because he did some of the storyboards and concept designs to films such as Alien, Tron, Fifth Element, The Abyss, things of that sort. So, so they may be indirectly familiar with some of Moebius's work.
No, again, I think this is someone whose influence is so pervasive that it's just sunk into the image banks of the shared subconscious. Because I think in his intro to the reissue of the Incal, Brian Michael Bendis says it's not a question about who's ripped this book off. It's more like who hasn't. On every page you'll find something that you've seen before, but this came first. And I think that, I think it's a good question. So if this is your first long form exposure in Moebius, were you blown away, or how did you?
I don't know if I was blown away. I enjoyed it quite a bit. There were parts of it, and we'll discuss this as we get into the specifics, that were a little wild, wacky, and a little confusing at times, but I expected that. This is kind of a fantastic sci-fi world. Let's mention a little bit more detail about the specifics of this. Now, this edition, The World of Edena, brings all of the various publications, its different chapters together, right? Yeah. So the first chapter was really the origin, which is curious, of how this became a longer work. That has been translated in the past as Star, but here it's called Upon a Star. So chapter 1 proper is Upon a Star. There's like a little intro part to this. Chapter 2 is The Gardens of Edena. Chapter 3, The Goddess. Chapter 4, Stel, and then the final chapter, Sra. So these have been available in English at certain times individually, the various chapters, and even through Marvel, you'd mentioned earlier. But this is the first time, I guess, in an English edition that everything has been brought together. And it's an interesting story, especially in its genesis, because it began as somewhat like a commercial that Moebius was going to be doing for Citroën?
Is it
the car company?
Is it Citroën? Yeah. Oh,
yeah, Citroën.
Yeah. And that's something funny too, where it's like I know that's rather it's I know there are American publishers, sometimes DC and I know Archaea they have done corporate comics, but they usually aren't very the public really isn't usually aware of them. They're sort of just little side money making ventures for them. But the idea of I don't know. I think for me at least, it's another one of those examples of how mainstream, how much a part of mainstream culture comics are in France. I remember when I went to the Angoulême Festival, there would be live drawing sessions where you get to watch a comics creator, an artist draw for 45 minutes, and it wasn't just fans. You'd go and you'd find just regular townsfolk who'd wandered in, who they would go to it the same way they went to a concert or a reading or some other cultural event or a performance. It was just what was on, and they wanted to get some culture on Saturday afternoon. So you see I just feel like that's and that recently there was like a consortium of luxury goods producers that hired a bunch of prominent science fiction writers to do stories about to speculate on luxury in the future, and that sort of this integration, I think, of a cultural production and commercial production that it operates on a different. It's a little different in France. So yeah, you definitely do. As an American reader, I did find it weird when the Citroën pops up in that story.
Well, let's mention this, and because this basically is the premise, right, of everything that will unfold. And at the beginning of the book, we're introduced to Stel and Atan, and these are two individuals. And at this point, you really can't call them like a man and a woman. They're just they're more androgynous figures, right? Because they're sexless, they're genderless, and they're investigating the disappearance of a satellite around a planet. And they get pulled into some kind of gravitational field or something, and on this kind of like asteroid, and they are propelled to the planet's surface. And then once they crash and they find out that they're okay, they discovered that the planet that they're on is very, very flat. And in fact, they named the planet Pool Ball. And they go out,
or perfectly
after they
round, rather, right?
Perfect. Well, yeah. But I mean, there's no contour to the land. That's why they call it, pool ball. And that they want to, after they get settled, to investigate this planet. And what they do to go out and investigate is they pull out this antique automobile, this Citroën, from the early part of the 20th century. And so this is where the commercial aspect of the story comes into play. But one of the things that Moebius does is he doesn't overemphasize the Citroën in such a way that you can assume that it was originally a story that was going to advertise a product, right? I think if you didn't know the genesis of the World of Edena, I don't think that you would be out of anything, or things wouldn't make sense to you. I find it a little charming that they break out this old car and they're going to use that to tool around this planet to find out what's going on.
No, but I think charm and just sheer visual beauty, charm and storytelling, and sheer visual beauty in the pictures are big components of Moebius's style. I mean, I do think you're right. I don't think it would stick out as product placement if you weren't aware of it. It would just seem like, because it's very graceful how he introduces a retro element, and it's not the only retro element that gets reintroduced. Like in the main body of the story, there's a lot of scenes of I don't know, like kind of Stone Age survival, atavistic scenes that are nevertheless common as sci-fi tropes, but the way he alternates between scenes that are set in specific past periods and scenes of far future periods, to me, that's a kind of a testament to how little science fiction has changed in the last 40 years, that we're still doing that, even if we're doing that in a more sort of conscious indulging of retro way. It's still this sort of like, oh yeah, we're on a 25th century ship, but we have a holodeck, or where we go back to the 30s, or this is a different planet, but they dress like our 50s, or that's that kind of. I think the Citroën kind of Citroën's appearance falls neatly into that trope, which is actually a really prominent part of the Edena storyline.
Right. Now, you were talking about the art style. We should mention that this is basically a clear line style that he employs here. So in some ways, it's different from some of his other work, a lot of his other work.
Yeah, and he deliberately limited himself as a challenge when he first started on this. But I think in the last book, SRA, the art is markedly different from the books preceding it, which were all done about 10 years before.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because I myself noticed a change in the art style. I mean, it's still, for all practical purposes, kind of a clear style. But I noticed the change in art or the evolution in Moebius's style with Edena before the last part. In fact, by the time we get to, I think it's the third story, which is the goddess, things become not only much more textured, but also the colors become richer and deeper than minimal. Because the first two books that we get, Upon a Star and the Gardens of Eden, those I think are definitely this kind of minimalist, clear line style. And, things are still clean in the next three, but it becomes a little more detailed. There's more visual granularity. And again, the coloring here, I think, is much more striking in the last two or three books than in the first couple.
And there's a deliberate, variation in the amount of detail depending on the time period being covered, too. Like when they're... I don't mean narrative time period so much as... like if it's like the stuff that's out in nature with rocks and animals and caveman type outfits is a lot more detailed than the future stuff, even facially.
So basically, okay, let's talk a little bit about the story because the story gets a little convoluted. I already set things up at the very beginning in the first part, Upon a Star, where you have both Stell and Atan who crash onto this planet, this really smooth place that they call Pull Ball. And there they eventually, in their Citroën, find this large pyramid and a community of aliens who were living around the pyramid. And they learn that these are all representatives of a variety of different races throughout the galaxy. And they've been pulled here for reasons unknown. But they do know that around this large pyramid, they're able to sustain themselves. And also, they're alive, but their aging has been halted. So they're kind of in some kind of stasis. So they've been here. They don't know why they're here. And they just assume that Stell and Atan have been drawn here for similar reasons. But at one point, Stell walks toward the pyramid because he feels some kind of pull, and he's able to do something that no one else has been able to do, to get near the pyramid and to breach the pyramid. So he just walks right into it, and they don't know what's going on, and it's around this point that the pyramid basically becomes like a spaceship, right? And it rises up off the ground, it pulls all the other creatures up into it, and then that's the end of that first part. And then in the second book, The Gardens of Edena, is when we see Stell and Atan, and they're by themselves. They wake up and they go, "Hey, what's happened? What's going on? Last thing we knew, we were being pulled up into this weird pyramid thing. The other creatures that had populated the base of the pyramid are gone." And they find themselves in this Edenic setting, a really lush garden world, and they're propelled out into that world. And this is where the fun begins, so to speak, because here we have two characters who are, of really an indeterminate gender and sex, and they find themselves slowly over time, especially when they start eating the food that sustains themselves in this land, of Edena. They start to grow hair because they didn't have hair before. Their bodies start to take on different forms. So with Atan, she becomes a she, in essence. Her hair grows longer, her breasts develop, and they also begin to have certain feelings, where Stell becomes passionately drawn to his friend Atan, who now he calls Atana, and craves her sexually. And when he approaches her for those reasons, she freaks out, whacks him over the head, and runs away. And they get separated, and it's this separation, basically, that begins the quest part of this narrative that lasts up until the final pages.
Yeah, I think one of the one of the things that dates this in terms of storytelling, just pure narrative technique, is this, but also for me lends it a certain charm, is how the story, Moebius is really exploring his characters. He's making it up as he goes along. Things are, and by his own confession, by his own confession, things are getting more complicated, things are deepening, things are shading, the world is opening out, storylines are proliferating, and it's all happening as he goes along, not in a sort of, so it doesn't have that feel. The storytelling has its ups, its slow moments and faster moments, has its ups and downs because it's just someone pushing it forward. It's not an arc that's planned for a set number of pages, for a set number of volumes, the way that a lot of stories feel today are deliberately done today, to either hook your interest or something. So your interest in here has to be sustained by sort of your attunement to, or lack thereof.
Right. On the trippy ride he's taking us on.
And I think because this story isn't divided into arcs or doesn't really have neat periodic cliffhangers in a sort of serialized sense, how into it you get really depends on how much you're along for Moebius's trippy space ride, right? Like it's kind of like, are you in the groove with him or not? And he's known to be a very new agey guy. That's like one of the things that people kind of laugh at him about now that it's out of fashion. But like, he dabbled with a lot of alternative therapies and quasi-cultish things, and like, so like, here I think it was why he got on so well with Jodorowsky too, who's whose stories are very based on this sort of mythic self-discovery template. In this case, it's like there are definitely themes of gender that are being explored in Edena. Also, like, and I think some of the narrative convolution you're talking about builds up at the end when he realizes like the levels of reality multiply, right? Like you have dreams inside realities inside dream, because he what he's always after is just, is the expansion of consciousness and this and when he does it right, partly because of his art, you get a real I think a genuine sense of wonder that's hard to attain for anyone, any kind of storyteller. But
right.
But yeah,
a couple things that you've mentioned is that this story is definitely trippy, and it gets trippier as the narrative progresses. And also, it is apparent, and he does admit, Moebius does say this, that he was kind of making some of this stuff up as it goes along, or as he was going along. And that's one of the things that's so enjoyable about this, right? I mean, you get a sense in reading this, or at least I did, that the creator himself probably didn't know what the next scene or the next step was in this story. But that's fine, right? You just strap yourself in and go along for the ride. You also mentioned something about the complexities or the levels of story become quite a bit more convoluted in the very last book, SRA or SRA, and that's clearly the case. I think this begins, though, toward the last part of that fourth book, which is, what is it, Stell? Yeah, that's the Stell chapter. And this is when we're reintroduced to Trollopen. Now, early on in the book, in that first chapter, Upon a Star, Trollopen is the character, or one of the characters that they meet at the base, that Atan and Stell meet at the base of this pyramid. And in fact, this is the individual that they've come searching for, Trollopen, because he was supposed to be monitoring a particular asteroid, and it's that asteroid that brings Stell and Atan to this planet. So we see him briefly in the first chapter, but then after that, he disappears, but he comes back in the fourth chapter, Stell. But we learned that Trollopen is also a character that we've been seeing or be seeing references to earlier, and that is the Paternum. And the Paternum is, I guess, this father godlike figure, as the name suggests, of this society called, it's called the Nest, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Nesters. And we don't know much about this society at first. The characters in the nest are humanoid, although we rarely see their faces because they wear these strange masks that look like some kind of Freudian nightmare, right? Really long noses and also, phallic parts in the back of their head that looks like it's just an extension from behind of the nose. And they wear these heavy suits that are air conditioned. So, and they're very suspicious of outnesters, people who are outside of their society, their culture. And these are also, we learn eventually, clones of Paternum. Again, this kind of god figure. So the god produces them, the god clones them. But this nefarious Paternum figure ends up becoming Trollopen in certain ways, and I don't want to give anything away here. I don't think we're in spoiler territory, but there's a linking in some way between this nefarious Paternum character and Trollopen. And this comes at the end of the fourth book, Stell. Then we get to the last one, Shra. It gets really confusing there, and it got to the point in Shra that I quit trying to make sense of everything, especially the dialogue. You mentioned those little Sputnik type of creatures that were flying around spouting bureaucratic babble.
Yeah, the hypototems.
Yes, the hypototems. And so there's if you're trying to make sense of every single thing that goes on in this last section, you're going to be frustrated. So just because it's over trippy, to put it lightly, and it gets weird, and even the art becomes much more surrealistic.
Well, I think also the storytelling just speeds up. I think that's the part of the issue is that suddenly the storytelling is far less decompressed than it was before, and everything just goes by a lot fast. Like the amount. And that's, I think, maybe problematic when you want to tell a story where there are multiple levels of reality.
Right. And you're right there. Yeah, it does become very decompressed to the point that compressed that it becomes prohibitive in terms of understanding. Especially in what you were mentioning, the levels of narration or dreaming, right? Because you have dreams within dreams within dreams, it seems.
Yeah, and then at the end you get to sort of a Brazil type moment where you think you finally hit the real reality, and this guy's gonna, but no, the guy's gonna choose dream over the real reality because it's possible that the dream, is in fact more real. Yeah, I mean, but even when he. There are scenes that and I know The Matrix is already a remix of tons of different stuff, but you can there are scenes where it reminded me of that as well, and also a lot of the art too. I feel like since I hadn't read this in its entirety before, I see how indebted Peters now in Amma is to this.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, just like the squiggles of color floating around in the air, and a lot of the framed art in the background of places, and also the levels of consciousness, right? Peters tries to put a more scientific frame on it with his AI achieving consciousness. That's a more contemporary idea, but yeah.
Yeah, it becomes strange now. In fact, you could read this last section, Shra, as Moebius on some kind of controlled substance.
Yeah, it
has that feel.
Yeah, and it definitely moves a lot swifter, and the frame, the panels are packed with a lot more stuff that's just kind of out of this world and not dwelled on. It does make the world feel a little richer to me, especially I like the simplicity of the first stories, and actually the first two short stories before the longer book-length stories began are actually my favorite, just because they managed to create an air of mystery while remaining in a very short amount of time. But at the same time, you can see he skips out on a lot of the backgrounds there, but that's no longer the case here.
Yeah. For the most part, you could even look at this book as primarily a quest narrative until you get to that final section, Shra, because once Atan or who becomes Atana and Stell separate, then Stell searching for Atana and then vice versa, I mean, that becomes the guiding force behind everything that happens and everything that surrounds that quest. I mean, there's still that quest element toward the very end, but it's given a much more complex twist with those aforementioned dream levels.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, what do you think of this overall? I mean, you said that this was the first time that you've read the World of Edena as a complete text.
Well, was
it what you expected?
I guess I still think Moebius's art is just the amount of inventiveness that's thrown away in casual detail, I think, is just phenomenal. And I've always also enjoyed how, I just find his art almost restful to look at. It's just visual. A charm really is what kind of billows off of it for him. Charm and beauty, so like even no matter how weird it gets, I find it oddly restful. And I like. I think the Nestors are I know you refer to them as a Freudian nightmare, but they're I like that he leavens their menace with what seems to be comical bungling. I mean, I think they look pretty.
Oh yeah, they're like the Keystone Cops.
Yeah, they look pretty funny, and so it's like, yeah, I mean, I guess what I get out of Moebius is that I feel like I always literally will see something I've never seen before, and when it's so easy. There's so many things that people say that of, and when you look at it, you see all the influences, and it's like, oh, okay, well, that's a variation on that, or that. But like, I really do feel like there are things that he comes up with that are not, they're just fresh out of his mind, like.
Right. This definitely has me wanting to read The Airtight Garage.
Yeah, you'll have to be really patient with the storytelling there. It's a lot. It's a lot choppier. It's pretty choppy.
Yeah, and from what I understand, I mean, Edena is it deals with a world that in some ways kind of overlaps with The Airtight Garage. Is that correct?
I don't remember if there are actual literal connections or if it just has a feel that's.
So it could be tonally and visually the Moebius world that is.
Yeah, there's definitely consistency throughout the Moebius. I mean, he loves pyramids.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are things that lizards, pyramids, cranes, crane-like dinosaurs, star-shaped jets of light.
Yeah. And, we have no way of knowing this, but I'd be curious to learn where the decision came from to start Dark Horse's Moebius Library with The World of Edena as the first release, and not something like, let's say, The Airtight Garage that came earlier.
Is Airtight not available right now from anyone?
I don't know if it's still in print. It had been available in English, right?
Yeah, it had been. Okay, so okay, yeah. I don't. Yeah, maybe it is because I think, like as you say, Edena is really accessible and user friendly through the long middle procession of books.
Right, and that middle section or the third part, the goddess, is the longest of the five. Yeah. But yeah, it definitely has whetted my appetite for Moebius, and I have to go now and seek more of him out.
Here's a tiny note just on translation, is that I think this is really, I mean, these are translations. They have a note about the translation, which is great. They talk about how they re-edited some of the old Marvel translations and to bring them in line with the French editions, and the SRA, the final chapter, was translated into the English for the first time by Dana Schutz, the editor, former Dark Horse editor, and Brendan Kander. But I mean, I think before that, there was a famous fan translation of SRA that was widely disseminated online, and it was the only English version that you could get. And but an interesting thing I find about this book is it's sort of unfortunate that almost the first thing you get is these text blocks, these pages of preface, because I think on the whole these books are really well translated, but like I think like the beginning, one of the beginning essays about Moebius especially is a good example of clunky translation that seems correct but really could use a lot of editorial smoothing, which is the section titled About the World of Edena, because like you can almost every sentence here is in the passive voice, and I know it's sort of an English bugbear or a bugbear of composition teachers to tell you to use the active voice, but it's a fact that passive constructions are much more common in French, and it's a calc, I think, to leave them untouched. I mean, sure, sometimes they're fine, but you don't want to just bring them over because that's how the sentence was, and that's how this section reads to me. I mean, it's yeah. So, but be as may, I think it's an interesting contrast because most of the book is much more dynamically translated, and I think that's because it's dialogue, and you recognize
right. Now
the
you mentioned these
dialogue.
Okay, so you mentioned, I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You say these text blocks at the beginning of chapters. Are you talking about these long quotes from Moebius?
No. I'm talking about the very beginning of the book. There's something that's called About the World of Edena.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, because there are these long blocks of quotes at the beginning of each section.
Yeah, those are okay. I mean, I think those are they're a little wonky, but I think that's maybe you also want to get a flavor of how he talks, and he's like there's idiosyncraticness to how he talks, and But I'm talking about,
and it also sets some kind of context of the chapter that follows, and it gives us at least a tad of an insight into what he was thinking.
Sure, I know. I think that's a really helpful book layout decision. Yeah, no, I was just talking about the essay up at the front.
Okay, about the World of Edena.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and we have actually a number of these introductory segments. There's the introduction from Moebius. And then there's also from him about the world of Edena. Then there is the about this edition, and then another page from Moebius beginning the Edena cycle. And so, I mean, that does seem a tad awkward. Those 4 introductory chunks, one right after the other.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so but I actually. Yeah, I wanted to share one of my favorite Moebius stories, though, which might be a good closer. Mm-hmm. Which is, have you heard? Did you hear back in 2012? Did you hear about his last words?
No, I did not.
No. So apparently, his last words, as reported by his wife, were, "Something's happening. I feel that I'm about to transmute. You have to give me the reparation codes." And it was like one of the most perfect, it's like the
reparation codes.
Yeah, the perfect last words for, the perfect last words for someone who does, trippy sci-fi, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's an interesting note to end on, but maybe an appropriate sending forth. So this month, Edward and I looked at Pushwagner's Soft City, which is published by New York Review Comics. And then we followed up with The World of Edena, the first in Dark Horse's Moebius Library series. And so 2 really interesting texts.
Absolutely.
Yep. And if you want to find deals on great books like this, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. And in fact, as Edward told you at the top of the show, you can find a great discount on The World of Edena if you go there right now. That's dcbservice.com.
40% off.
That's right. And, you really can't beat that price.
No, not for like this is 300 plus pages of Moebius, a full story cycle. Yeah.
Beautiful, too. Beautiful produced book. And after you do get your Moebius and other comics through DCB service, then get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's show. If you go to the website comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message via SpeakPipe from the comfort of your own computing device. Or you can pick up the phone and call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or hey, drop us an email at 2guys@comicsalternative.com or write me directly at edward@comicsalternative.com.
Or email me directly at derek@comicsalternative.com. You can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Spotify. And if you're an Android user, you can get us through Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is, again, comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways for people to get in touch with us. And so, if you want to be like Paul and Chris and send us email about our Euro comics series, we'd love that. And we could share that with our listeners in future episodes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Please do keep the emails coming. We'd love to hear from you.
That's right. And until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Edward.
We'll see you later.
Bye.